Don't touch him. He'll get you killed just by breathing near you. Margaret Doyle would remember those words for the rest of her life because they came from the mouth of a dying man, half buried in snow, warning the woman trying to save him that saving him was the most dangerous thing she would ever do. Before this story goes any further, if you believe an old woman's courage can still shake an entire town, subscribe to this channel. And tell me in the comments what city you're watching from tonight, because I want to see how far this story travels. The wind came down off Blackwater Ridge like something with teeth. And Margaret Doyle had lived 74 years in these mountains, long enough to know the difference between an ordinary snowstorm and something that wanted to kill you. This one wanted to kill you. She could feel it in the way the walls of her farmhouse groaned, in the way the old stovepipe rattled against its bracket, in the way the single porch light flickered like it was fighting for its own life against the dark. She was not supposed to be outside. She knew that. Sheriff Calloway had said it himself just 2 days before, standing in her kitchen with his hat in his hands and that patronizing tone men used when they thought they were protecting a woman instead of talking down to her. Margaret, you keep those doors locked tonight and every night this week. We got word there's Hell's Angels passing through the county. Bad business follows men like that. You understand me? She had nodded because it was easier than arguing, but some stubborn part of her, the part that had spent 31 years standing in front of classrooms full of restless children and never once backed down from a challenge, had bristled at being told what to be afraid of. Still, she had not planned on going outside that night. She had planned on doing exactly what the sheriff told her. She had banked the fire, checked the locks, and settled into the chair by the window with a cup of tea going cold in her hands and a photograph of her son Daniel on the side table, the way she did every night, because talking to a photograph was better than talking to no one at all. That was when she heard it. Not a howl of wind, not the creak of a branch. A sound underneath all of that, thin and human, carried on a gust that slammed into the side of the house so hard the window shuddered. She told herself it was an animal, a dog maybe lost and confused in the storm. She told herself that for exactly as long as it took to hear the sound again, longer this time, and unmistakably a voice. Margaret set down her tea. Her hands, she noticed, were shaking, and not from the cold. No, she said out loud to the empty room, to the photograph of her son, to the ghost of her husband who had died in the very chair she was sitting in. No, Margaret, you are not going out there. The voice came a third time, weaker now, fading into the wind like it was losing the argument with the storm itself. She was already reaching for her coat. The cold hit her like a wall the moment she opened the door, a physical blow that stole the air from her lungs and turned her breath to ice crystals before it even left her mouth. The porch light did nothing against the wall of white beyond it. She could see maybe 10 feet in any direction, and beyond that, nothing but the roaring dark. "Hello," she called, and the wind tore the word out of her mouth and threw it somewhere over the ridge. "Is someone there?" Nothing. Just the storm laughing at her. She almost went back inside. She told herself later that if she had turned around in that exact moment, gone back to her chair, and her cold tea and her memories, none of what followed would have happened, and maybe that would have been the safer life. But safety had never been the thing Margaret Doyle chased. She had chased purpose her whole life, in the classroom, in her marriage, in the raising of a son who had grown into a man she was prouder of than she ever managed to tell him before he was gone. And something in her, some old surviving ember of that purpose, would not let her walk away from a voice crying out in a blizzard. She grabbed the flashlight from the hook by the door and stepped off the porch into snow that swallowed her boots to the ankle. "Hello," she shouted again, louder, angrier now, as if she could bully the storm into showing her what it was hiding. "If someone's out here, say something." This time the answer came immediate and close. A groan of pain no more than 30 feet from where she stood, somewhere near the old fence line that marked the edge of her property. Margaret moved toward it before her mind had even finished deciding to. The flashlight beam swept across churned snow, across the black twisted shape of a motorcycle on its side, half buried in a drift, its front wheels still spinning uselessly in the wind, and then across a man. He was face down. His leather jacket, she would learn later, it was the wrong kind of leather for weather like this, too. Thin, too torn open at the shoulder where road and metal had shredded through, it was crusted white with frost. One leg was bent at an angle that made her stomach turn. "Oh, God," Margaret whispered, and dropped to her knees beside him in the snow, the cold soaking instantly through her nightgown and robe. "Oh, God, can you hear me?" The man's head turned barely, and one eye cracked open, And even half frozen and delirious, there was something sharp and alert in that single eye, something that was already calculating danger even as his body was failing. Get away. He rasped, the words slurred and broken. Lady, get inside. Get away from me. You're going to die out here, Margaret said, already working her hands under his shoulder, trying to gauge how she could possibly move a man twice her size through snow up to her knees. I am not leaving you to freeze in my own front yard. You don't understand. His hand, when it closed around her wrist, was like ice, like touching a corpse, and yet the grip had a desperate strength to it that startled her inner. They're looking for me. If they find me here, they'll... His voice broke apart into a fit of shuddering that might have been a cough or might have been a sob. They'll hurt you too. Who is looking for you? He didn't answer. His eye rolled back, his grip on her wrist went slack, and his head fell forward into the snow. Margaret Doyle had exactly 1/2 of 1 second to make a decision that would change the rest of her life, and she did not spend it weighing the sheriff's warning or the patch on the dead man's jacket that she could now see clearly in the flashlight beam, the winged skull, the words that made every hair on the back of her neck rise. Hell's Angels. She spent that half second thinking of her son Daniel, and the last thing he had ever said to her on a hospital bed 3 years before he died in a car accident 2 towns over. You always taught me that a person's worth isn't in what they look like, Mom. It's in what they do when nobody's watching. Nobody was watching now. Just her, an old woman in a bathrobe, kneeling in a blizzard beside a dying stranger with a killer's patch on his jacket. All right, she said mostly to herself and got her arms under him. All right, let's go. What followed was the hardest physical labor of Margaret's life. She was 74 years old, 5'4", and the man in the snow was easily 200 pounds of dead weight wrapped in wet leather and frozen denim. She could not lift him. She could not even really drag him in any traditional sense. What she did over the course of nearly 15 agonizing minutes was heave him a few inches at a time, planting her boots hauling on the collar of his jacket, screaming at her own body every time her knees threatened to buckle, screaming at the storm every time it tried to steal her balance. Move, she gasped at one point, to no one, to herself, to God. Move, you stubborn old woman, move. Halfway to the porch, her flashlight went dark. The battery's dead, or the cold too much for them, and she finished the last 20 feet in near total blindness, guided only by the dim glow of her own porch light and the desperate need to get this man somewhere warm before his heart simply stopped. She got him up the porch steps by main force and sheer terror, and she got the door open, and she got him inside, and then she collapsed on the floor beside him, her chest heaving, her whole body screaming in protest, snow melting into puddles around both of them on her kitchen floor. For a moment, she simply lay there staring up at her own ceiling, wondering if she had just done the bravest thing of her life or the stupidest. Then the man made a sound, a wet, ragged gasp, and Margaret forced herself back onto her knees. Okay, she said, breathless. Okay, let's see what we're dealing with. She had been a teacher, not a nurse, but 31 years in a classroom, teaches a woman how to handle a crisis without panicking, how to triage a dozen problems at once and address the worst one first. The worst one here, obviously, was the cold. She hauled every blanket she owned off the hall closet shelf and packed them around him, and she got the fire built back up to a roar, and she filled her largest pot with water and set it to warm on the stove, because some instinct told her that warming him too fast could be as dangerous as the cold itself. It was while she was cutting away the ruined sleeve of his jacket, trying to get a look at the wound beneath, that she found the first thing that told her this was no ordinary biker who'd simply run off the road in bad weather. Strapped to his forearm, hidden beneath the jacket sleeve, where a normal search would never find it, was a small hard case. Medical, she thought at first, and when she unclipped it and opened it with trembling fingers, she found insulin, a glucose meter, syringes still sealed in their wrappers. A diabetic biker stranded in a blizzard, hiding his own medical supplies like they were contraband. And beneath that, tucked into an inner pocket, sewn crudely into the jacket lining, something else. Small, plastic. A flash drive, black, unmarked, taped over on one end, like someone had wanted to make sure it never accidentally came loose. Margaret stared at it for a long moment, the firelight throwing shadows across her kitchen, the wind screaming outside like it wanted back in. What did you get yourself into? She murmured, and it wasn't really a question for the unconscious man on her floor. It was a question for herself, for the choice she'd already made and could not now unmake. She put the flash drive back exactly where she'd found it and turned her attention to his leg. The angle told her it was broken maybe in more than one place, and there was nothing she could do about that tonight, not with the storm outside and the nearest hospital 40 minutes away, on roads that would be nothing but ice and drift by now. She splinted it as best she could with a rolled magazine and strips torn from an old bedsheet, gritting her teeth against his groans, whispering apologies she wasn't sure he could even hear. It was almost an hour before his eyes opened again properly, this time focused and aware in a way they had not been in the snow. He looked at the fire. He looked at the blankets. He looked at his own splinted leg. And then he looked at Margaret sitting in the chair beside him, with her son's photograph still on the table, and something in his face crumpled, not with pain, but with something closer to disbelief. "You brought me inside," he said. His voice was raw, but clearer now. "You actually brought me inside." "You were going to die in my yard," Margaret said simply. "I wasn't going to let that happen on my conscience." "Do you know what I am?" He gestured weakly at his own jacket, at the patch she had already seen, at the ink crawling up both his forearms in designs she didn't recognize, but understood well enough to know they meant something serious. "Do you know what people like me do to people like you?" "I know what the sheriff told me," Margaret said. "I know what the television tells everyone. I also know a dying man when I see one, and I know I wasn't raised to step over a dying man because I was scared of what he might be." He stared at her for a long moment, and something in his exhausted, pain-racked face shifted, softened, before hardening right back into fear. "You need to get me out of here," he said, suddenly trying to sit up and failing, gasping as the movement jarred his broken leg. "Right now. Tonight. Before." "Before what?" Margaret said, gently pressing him back down. "You are not going anywhere with that leg, young man, storm or no storm. Now you tell me your name and you tell me why a diabetic man was riding a motorcycle through a blizzard, because I did not drag 200 pounds of frozen stranger across my own front yard just to be told nothing." For a moment she thought he would refuse. His jaw worked. His eyes darted toward the window, toward the door, toward every possible exit from a conversation he clearly did not want to have. But whatever strength had been holding him together was clearly failing, and exhaustion, or maybe just the simple human need to not be alone with a secret this heavy won out. "Wesley," he said finally. "Wesley Callahan, Wes." "Margaret Doyle." She said it like an exchange of terms in a treaty neither of them had fully agreed to yet. "Now the rest of it, Wesley." He closed his eyes. When he opened them again, the fear in them had a different quality, not the animal panic of a man simply afraid of dying in the cold, but something colder and more specific. "There's something in my jacket," he said quietly. "You probably already found it, being the kind of woman who patches up a stranger's leg without flinching. That drive isn't mine, not really. I was supposed to deliver it 2 days ago to people who could do something with what's on it. I never made it. My bike went down on the ridge road. I don't even know if it was the ice or somebody ran me off, and I've been trying to get anywhere at all ever since. Deliver it to who? Doesn't matter right now." His hand found her wrist again, the same desperate grip from the snow, though weaker now. "What matters is that if the wrong people find out I ended up here in this house with you, they are not going to knock politely and ask for it back. You understand what I'm telling you. I didn't ask to bring this into your home. I would have died out there rather than drag an innocent person into this if I'd had any choice about where I crashed." Margaret felt something cold settle in her stomach that had nothing to do with the storm outside. "What people, Wesley?" His eyes went to the window again, to the black nothing beyond the glass where the storm raged on, indifferent, to the small human drama unfolding inside 4 wooden walls. "The kind who wear badges," he said, "and the kind who don't need to." The fire cracked, the wind howled, and somewhere out in that impossible white dark, though neither of them could have known it, yet headlights were already beginning to move along the county road toward Blackwater Ridge, searching. Margaret sat back slowly in her chair, looking at this stranger she had pulled from the snow, at the fear that had not left his face even now that he was warm and alive, and she felt the shape of the decision she'd made an hour ago settling onto her shoulders like a weight she could not now put down. "Rest," she said finally, because there was nothing else to say that would make either of them feel better. "You're not going anywhere tonight, regardless of who's looking. Rest, and in the morning we'll figure out what in God's name I've gotten myself into." He didn't argue. Exhaustion and blood loss pulled him under within minutes, his breathing evening out, his grip on her wrist finally loosening. Margaret sat beside him for a long time after that, watching the rise and fall of his chest, listening to the storm claw at her home, and glancing every so often at the small, hard lump beneath his jacket, where the flash drive lay hidden, wondering what secret could possibly be worth a man risking his life on a mountain road in a blizzard rather than let it die with him. She did not sleep that night. She sat in her chair with a shotgun she had not held in 15 years resting across her lap, an old habit from a husband long buried, and she watched the door and she watched the windows, and every time the wind slammed against the house hard enough to rattle the frames, her heart lurched with the certainty that this was it, that whoever Wesley Callahan was hiding from had finally arrived. Nobody came that night, but somewhere around 4 in the morning in the thin gray hour before dawn, when the storm finally began to loosen its grip on the mountain, Margaret thought she saw, through a gap in the curtains, a set of headlights pause on the county road at the bottom of her long driveway. Pause and hold, unmoving for nearly a full minute before finally continuing on into the dark. She told herself it was nothing, a neighbor lost in the storm checking their bearings. She did not believe it even as she thought it. By the time the gray light of morning finally broke over Blackwater Ridge, Margaret Doyle had made a decision of her own, one she would not share with Wesley for several more hours, one that would prove to be the second most dangerous choice of her long, and until 3 days ago, entirely uneventful life. She was not going to call the sheriff. Not yet. Not until she understood exactly what kind of storm she had actually pulled into her home and whether the blizzard outside had ever really been the most dangerous thing on that mountain at all. Wes woke just after 7, gray-faced but lucid, and the first thing he did was reach for the inner pocket of his jacket, patting at it with the frantic energy of a man checking that his own heart was still beating. When his fingers found the flash drive still in place, some of the tension went out of his shoulders, though not all of it, not nearly all of it. "You didn't look," he said, and it wasn't quite a question. "I looked," Margaret said, setting a cup of coffee down on the table beside him, "and I put it right back. I'm nosy, Wesley, not a thief." A ghost of a smile crossed his face before the fear crowded it back out. "You should have looked closer. You should understand what you're sitting on. Then tell me." He was quiet for a long moment, staring into the coffee sheet handed him, like it might contain the answer to a question he'd been avoiding for days. 4 months ago, he said finally, I got pulled over outside of Route 9, middle of nowhere, 2 counties over from here. Except it wasn't a real stop. The man who pulled me over wasn't wearing a uniform that matched anything on his own patrol car, and when I asked to see his badge number, he put a gun to my head instead. Margaret's hand tightened around her own coffee cup. "I got away," Wes continued, "barely, and I made the mistake of telling the wrong person about it, someone I thought I could trust, someone who turned out to already be involved. Since then, I've had 3 men, real officers, actual county deputies, quietly reach out to me because they'd seen things too. Money moving where it shouldn't, evidence disappearing from lockups, a whole operation running drugs and worse straight through this county with badges providing the cover." He tapped the pocket where the drive sat hidden. "Everything they collected is on there, names, dates, bank transfers, enough to bury half the department 2 counties over, and pieces of this one too, if it ever reached the right hands. And you were bringing it where? State investigator 3 hours south. Except somebody knew I was moving, and somebody made sure my bike never made it past this ridge." His eyes found hers, hollow and exhausted and terrified in equal measure. "I don't know if it was an accident, Margaret. I've turned that thought over and over since I woke up in your kitchen, and I honestly don't know. But if it wasn't, if somebody ran me off that road on purpose, then somebody already knows I went down near here. And it will not take them long to search every house between the crash site and the county line." The kitchen went very quiet. Outside, the storm had finally passed, leaving behind a hard blue morning sky and drifts of snow taller than Margaret had seen in a decade. And in the sudden silence after days of screaming wind, the world felt unnervingly still, unnervingly watched. "Then we don't wait for them to search," Margaret said, surprising herself with the steadiness in her own voice. "We get that drive to someone who can actually use it today before anyone comes looking. You don't understand these people." "No." Margaret agreed, standing and moving to the window, looking out at her own long driveway, buried under 2 feet of fresh snow, at the empty white road beyond it that suddenly did not feel empty at all. "But I understand my son didn't raise, didn't live, didn't die for me to sit in this house and do nothing while a man bleeds out over a secret that could save other people's lives." I've made my decision, Wesley. The question now is whether you trust me enough to let me help you see it through. Wes looked at her for a long moment, this old widowed schoolteacher, standing in her flannel robe in a kitchen, still damp from melted snow, and something in his exhausted face cracked open into an expression that looked almost like grief. You remind me of somebody, he said quietly. Somebody who helped me once back when I had nothing left and no reason to keep going. Somebody who looked at me the way you're looking at me right now, like I was worth saving, even when I didn't believe it myself. Who? But before he could answer, the sound reached them both at the same moment, cutting through the still morning air with a clarity that made Margaret's blood run cold. An engine coming up the long driveway, moving slow and deliberate through the snow. Wes's whole body went rigid. Get down, he hissed, already trying to drag himself off the couch despite his splinted leg. Margaret, get away from the window now. Margaret's hand found the curtain edge, and through the narrow gap, she watched a county sheriff's cruiser roll to a stop at the bottom of her drive, its light bar dark, its engine idling, two figures visible in the front seat, unmoving, simply watching the house. Watching and waiting for something, Margaret was suddenly and terribly certain she did not want to give them. Margaret, Wes's voice had dropped to barely a whisper, urgent and raw. Whatever they say when they come to that door, whatever badge they show, you do not let them inside this house. Do you hear me? Do not open that door. Margaret Doyle, 74 years old widow, retired teacher, a woman who 3 days ago had never so much as raised her voice at a delivery. Man felt her heart pounding against her ribs like something trying to escape, and found to her own genuine surprise that beneath the fear was something else entirely. Something that felt almost like the old fire she used to feel standing in front of 30 restless students on the first day of a new school year. The sense that whatever happened next, she was not going to be the kind of woman who simply let it happen to her. She let the curtain fall back into place, turned to Wes with a steadiness that surprised them both, and said the only thing that felt true in that entire frozen, terrifying morning. Nobody is taking you out of my house today, Wesley Callahan. Not until I understand exactly who we're dealing with and exactly what they think they're owed. Outside, the cruiser's engine cut off, and in the sudden ringing silence that followed, two car doors opened, one after the other, slow and unhurried, the sound of men who had all the time in the world and knew exactly where they were going. Margaret's hand did not move toward the door. Instead, it moved toward the shotgun still leaning against the wall by the fireplace, the same one she had held all through the night, and she picked it up with a steadiness that startled even her. Get behind the couch, she whispered to Wes. Now. Margaret, if that's Pierce out there, a shotgun is not going to... I did not ask for your opinion on my shotgun, Wesley. I asked you to get down. He obeyed, dragging his splinted leg with a grimace, wedging himself into the narrow space between the couch and the wall where the curtains would keep him hidden from anyone glancing through the window. Margaret set the shotgun down within easy reach on the side table, ranged her robe like a woman who had nothing at all to hide, and opened the front door before the men on her porch had even finished climbing the steps. Morning, she said, pleasant and brittle as new ice. Can I help you, gentlemen? The one in front was young, maybe 30, with a jaw that looked like it had been carved for the specific purpose of looking trustworthy on camera. His uniform was crisp, despite the storm, too crisp, Margaret thought, for a man who'd supposedly been out on roads like these all night. His name tag read Pierce. Mrs. Doyle. He smiled with just his mouth. Deputy Logan, Pierce County Sheriff's Department. This is Deputy Hale. He gestured to the second man, older, heavier, silent, standing half a step back and with his hand resting a little too casually near his belt. We're doing wellness checks along the Ridge Road this morning. Storm knocked out power to half the county, and we had a report of a motorcycle accident somewhere near your property line last night. You wouldn't have seen or heard anything unusual, would you, ma'am? Margaret felt her heart slam once hard against her ribs and forced her face into the exact same expression she used to wear when a student lied to her about missing homework. Mild patient, faintly amused. A motorcycle, in this storm. She let out a short laugh. Deputy, I could barely see my own porch light last night. What kind of fool would be out on a bike in that? The kind who doesn't have a choice sometimes, Pierce said, and something in the way he said it made the hair on Margaret's arms rise. His eyes moved past her shoulder into the house, lingering a half-second too long, on the blankets still piled on the couch, on the damp patch on the floor that had not fully dried from melted snow. Mind if we come in and warm up a minute, ma'am? Long night out there. I would, Margaret said sweetly. Mind terribly, actually. I'm an old woman alone in her home, deputy, and I don't let strange men inside just because they're wearing a costume that says they're allowed to. No offense meant. Pierce's smile flickered just barely, just enough for Margaret to see the temper underneath it. It's not a costume, ma'am. It's a uniform. Then you won't mind showing me your badge number so I can call it into the station and confirm you're really who you say you are. She kept her voice light, almost playful, the voice of a harmless old lady being appropriately cautious. Nothing more. You understand? A woman alone up here can't be too careful. The silence that followed lasted exactly 3 seconds too long. Of course, Pierce said finally, and rattled off a number so fast Margaret knew instantly it was fabricated, a string of digits meant to sound official and mean absolutely nothing. Look, ma'am, I'll be straight with you. We got a call that a member of a motorcycle gang, dangerous individual, wanted for questioning in an ongoing investigation might have gone down somewhere on this stretch of road. If you saw anything at all, it's important you tell us now, for your own safety. For my safety, Margaret repeated. Yes, ma'am. Men like that, they're not the kind of people you want showing up at your door in the middle of the night. Margaret thought of Wes crouched behind her couch, diabetic, broken-legged, half-frozen, terrified out of his mind, and thought of the two men standing in front of her right now. Badges, gleaming smiles, practiced eyes, hard as river stones. It is. Well, she said, if I see any dangerous bikers wandering my property, deputy, I will be sure to call it in. Now, if that's all I've got, a wood stove that needs tending, and I'd rather not lose more heat standing here with my door open. Pierce did not move. For one terrible, stretched-out moment, Margaret was certain he was going to push past her badge or no badge, and she felt her hand twitch toward the shotgun on the side table close enough to reach far enough to make her wonder if she'd get there in time. Then from somewhere down the driveway, a radio crackled, and the older Deputy Hale said something low that Margaret couldn't catch. Pierce's jaw tightened. We'll be in touch, Mrs. Doyle, he said, backing off the porch, one slow step at a time, his eyes never leaving hers. You have yourself a good day. And Mrs. Doyle, he paused at the bottom of the steps. If you do happen to remember something later, don't call the station. Call me directly. He handed her a card plain white, nothing but a phone number scrawled on it in pen, no department, letterhead, no badge, insignia. Sometimes things get lost in the shuffle up there. I'd rather handle this personally. Margaret took the card between two fingers like it was something diseased, smiled her best harmless old lady smile, and closed the door the moment both men turned toward their cruiser. She stood with her back against the door for a full 10 seconds, listening to her own heartbeat roar in her ears before she trusted her legs to carry her back to the couch. They're gone, she said, and Wes dragged himself up from behind the couch, his face gray with pain and something worse than pain. That's not a real badge number, he said. I could hear it from here. He made that up on the spot. I know. Margaret was still staring at the plain white card in her hand. He gave me this instead. Told me to call him directly if I remembered anything. No department letterhead. No name of the actual sheriff's office anywhere on it. She looked up at Wes. You know this man. Logan Pierce. Wes said the name like something bitter caught in his throat. He's one of the names on that drive, Margaret. Not the top of the list, but close to it. Word was he ran security for the transport routes, made sure certain vehicles got waved through certain checkpoints without ever getting searched. And he just stood on my porch and told me to call him personally if I saw anything. Because he already knows, Wes said. And for the first time since she'd pulled him out of the snow, his voice cracked with something that sounded like genuine despair. He already knows I'm here, Margaret. That whole wellness check nonsense, that was him confirming it, not investigating it. He's not going to knock again next time. Margaret set the card down on the table like it might bite her. Then we don't wait for a next time. She moved to the window, peering through the gap in the curtain, watching the cruiser sit at the bottom of the driveway for nearly a full minute before it finally pulled away, crawling slow down the snow-packed road. Not the speed of men in a hurry, the speed of men who wanted to be seen, taking their time. Wanted her to know they weren't afraid, weren't rushing because they had all the time in the world. Margaret, Wes's voice had gone quiet and strange behind her. I need to tell you something, and I need you to actually hear it, not just push through it the way you've been pushing through everything since you dragged me off that fence line. She turned. Go on. There is no clean way out of this now. You opening that door and lying to a corrupt deputy's face, that's not a small thing. You can walk back tomorrow. The moment you did that, you stopped being an innocent old woman who happened to find an injured stranger. You became a witness, maybe worse than a witness. In his mind right now, you are someone actively protecting evidence that could put him and everyone connected to him behind bars for the rest of their lives. He held her gaze, unflinching despite the pain etched into every line of his face. People like that do not let witnesses become inconvenient. They make witnesses become disappeared. The word hung in the kitchen air like smoke. Margaret felt something cold settle behind her sternum. Not fear exactly, or not only fear. Something closer to clarity. Closer to the specific sharpening focus she used to feel decades ago, the moment a fire drill bell went off in her classroom and 30 pairs of eyes turned to her for direction. There was no room in that feeling for panic. There was only room for the next necessary action. Then we get that drive out of this house today, she said, before he decides he's tired of waiting. How my leg is broken in 2 places, Margaret. I can't drive, I can't ride, I can barely stand up without the room spinning. And even if I could, they've almost certainly got eyes on every road leading off this ridge by now. Margaret was already moving toward the hall closet, pulling out an old canvas bag her husband used to use for hunting trips, her mind racing through every option and rejecting each one in turn. Call the state investigator directly, but with what her landline that anyone could tap, or a cell signal that barely functioned in the best of weather up here. Drive him herself in her own truck down roads that Pierce's people were surely already watching. Hide the drive somewhere on the property and wait, but wait for what? For Pierce to lose interest, for the storm to somehow undo what had already been set in motion. There's a man, West said suddenly, and something in his voice made Margaret stop and turn back to him. Someone I should have called the second I woke up in your house instead of hiding it from you like a coward. His name's Duke. He's not exactly law enforcement. A ghost of something that might have been a bitter smile crossed his face. He's the president of my club, the Hells Angels chapter I ride with. And before you say anything, before you let everything the sheriff's office ever told you about people like us crowd back into your head, you should know that if I get one message to him, one message telling him where I am and what's happened, there is not a corrupt deputy in this county who will be able to touch either one of us. Margaret stood very still, the canvas bag hanging forgotten from her hand. You want me to call a motorcycle gang, she said slowly, to come here, to my home. I want you to call the only people on this earth right now who have both the reason and the ability to actually protect you, Wes said, and there was nothing pleading in his voice now, only a terrible plain honesty. I know what you were told about us. I know the patch on my jacket probably scared you half to death the second you saw it lying next to me in the snow. But Margaret, listen to me. Everybody in my club knows what I was carrying and why. Some of them have brothers who got hooked on product that came through this county because men like Pierce made sure it never got stopped at the border. This isn't just loyalty to me. This is personal for every single one of them. For a long moment, Margaret said nothing at all. She thought of the sheriff standing in her kitchen 2 days ago, hat in his hands, warning her about dangerous men passing through the county. She thought of Pierce's badge number invented on the spot and the plain white card with no department markings sitting on her table like an unexploded device. She thought finally and inevitably of her son Daniel, and the strange twisting feeling in her chest whenever West mentioned that someone had once helped him, the way she was helping him now, someone he clearly still grieved, though he had not yet told her who. How do you get a message to him, she said, without a phone that works and without leaving this house? Relief flooded Wes's face so fast and so total that Margaret understood in that instant exactly how frightened he had actually been of dying up here alone, an unknown worse than the fear of Pierce, worse than the fear of the storm. There's a number, he said. A dead drop line, we call it, goes straight to a burner Duke keeps for exactly this kind of situation. If your landline still works, even a little static, and all I can get a message through in under a minute. Code words, nothing that'll mean anything to anyone listening in, but Duke will understand exactly what it means. Margaret was already crossing to the phone mounted on her kitchen wall, an old rotary relic she'd never bothered replacing because it worked just fine for calling her sister twice a month, and lifted the receiver to her ear. Dial tone thin and crackling with static, but there. It's alive, she said, and carried the phone across the room to where Wes sat setting it in his lap, along with the cord stretched to its absolute limit. His hands shook as he dialed, whether from cold or fear or blood loss. Margaret couldn't tell anymore, and the line rang twice before a gruff voice answered on the other end, so loud even Margaret standing 3 feet away could hear it. Yeah, it's Wes. A pause electric with disbelief. Wes, Jesus Christ. We've had eyes out for you since your bike didn't check in Tuesday. Where the hell are you? Blackwater Ridge. I went down in the storm, Duke, and I'm hurt, bad legs broken, but that's not the problem. The problem is, I've got Pierce's people already sniffing around the house where I landed. Duke's voice went from relief to something flat and dangerous in half a second. Pierce is on your location. Was here 20 minutes ago, wearing a badge pretending it's a wellness check, but he knows Duke. He knows I'm here, and he's got a woman's whole life hanging in the wind because of it. She pulled me off the ground last night, dragged me inside her own house in the middle of that blizzard, patched me up, and she's already stood on her porch and lied straight to Pierce's face to protect me. There was a silence on the line that stretched long enough. Margaret wondered if the call had dropped. She's got the drive, Duke asked finally. It's still on me, but she's not safe anymore. None of us are not with Pierce circling like this. Address. Wes gave it, his voice steadying now that he had somewhere to direct the fear, someone else finally sharing the weight of it. Duke, I mean it. Come loud. Whatever Pierce is planning, he needs to see exactly what he's dealing with before he decides to do something stupid to an old woman who never asked for any of this. We ride in an hour, Duke said, and the line went dead. Wes lowered the receiver slowly, his whole body sagging, with a mixture of relief and exhaustion so profound it looked almost like collapse. An hour, he said. They'll be here in an hour. Margaret took the phone from his shaking hands and hung it back on the wall, and for a moment neither of them said anything at all, the weight of the decision settling over the kitchen like a held breath. An hour, Margaret repeated. Wesley, that man out there, Pierce, he wasn't just checking a box this morning. You said it yourself, he was confirming. What if he doesn't wait an hour to come back? As if summoned by the words themselves, the sound reached them both in the same instant. A second engine, then a third coming up the same driveway Pierce's cruiser had left not 20 minutes before, moving faster this time, without any of the earlier pretense of casual patience. Margaret's blood went to ice. She crossed to the window in 3 quick strides and looked out through the gap in the curtain to see not one cruiser this time, but 2, plus an unmarked black SUV behind them. All 3 vehicles pulling to a stop at angles across the bottom of her driveway, blocking any possible escape route down the mountain. Wes? Her voice came out flatter and calmer than she felt the old teacher's voice, the one that could freeze a chaotic classroom mid-riot. They're back, and there's more of them this time. Wes was already trying to drag himself upright, his face white with pain and terror, in equal measure reaching for the couch arm to pull himself to standing on his one good leg. The cellar, he gasped. You said you had a cellar last night. When you were looking at my leg, you mentioned it, an old root cellar under this house. It's small, it's cold, and with that leg, you'll never make the stairs down without screaming loud enough to bring the roof down on both our heads. Margaret, I would rather scream in pain in a hole in the ground than get found sitting in your living room when they come through that door. His eyes found hers, desperate and pleading, and terrifyingly lucid despite everything his body was going through. Please, you've already done more for me than anyone had a right to ask. Let me at least try to keep you from getting dragged any further into this than you already are. Outside, car doors were already slamming more than she'd heard the first time, 4, maybe 5, and Margaret's mind flew through the calculus of the next 60 seconds with a speed that startled her. The cellar entrance was through a trap door beneath the kitchen rug, accessible only if you knew exactly where to lift the floorboard seam, something she and her late husband had built themselves 30 years ago, as a place to store preserves, and in the deepest superstitious corner of both their minds as a storm shelter for exactly the kind of violent weather that had brought Wes to her door in the first place. Up, she said, already hauling him to his feet with a strength she did not know she still possessed, his arm slung over her shoulder, his weight nearly buckling her knees. Kitchen, now, and bite down on something if you need to scream, because I am not explaining a scream to Deputy Pierce. They made it to the kitchen in a lurching, gasping, half-dragged nightmare of a journey that took less than 15 seconds and felt to Margaret like 15 minutes, every step accompanied by a stifled groan from Wes that she was certain must be audible from the driveway. She hauled back the rug, found the seam with fingers that remembered exactly where 30 years of habit had worn a groove into the wood, and pulled the trapdoor open onto a black square of cold stone stairs leading down into the dark. "Down," she said, and helped lower him as gently as speed allowed onto the top step, watching him grit his teeth against a scream that came out instead as a strangled, wet gasp of pain as his broken leg took weight it should never have taken. Outside boots hit the porch steps. Multiple sets, heavy and unhurried and absolutely certain of themselves. Margaret shoved the flash drive which Wes had pressed into her hand at the last second with shaking fingers deep into the pocket of her robe, kicked the rug back over the closed trapdoor with more force than grace, and had just enough time to snatch her tea kettle off the stove and set it whistling on the burner. A domestic prop evidence of an old woman going about her ordinary morning before the first fist hit her front door hard enough to rattle the frame. "Mrs. Doyle," Pierce's voice no longer wearing even the thin costume of politeness from before. "Sheriff's Department, open the door." Margaret took one single steadying breath, the kind she used to take before walking into a parent-teacher conference. She knew was going to go badly, smoothed her robe, and walked to the door with the kettle still whistling behind her like the most normal sound in the world. She opened it to find Pierce standing there with 4 men behind him now, instead of one. None of them wearing the calm, patient smile from 20 minutes earlier, all of them with hands resting on holstered weapons in a way that felt less like caution and more like promise. "Deputy Pierce," Margaret said, arching an eyebrow with a composure she absolutely did not feel. "Back so soon? I take it my baking isn't the reason for the return visit. We have reason to believe you're harboring a fugitive, Mrs. Doyle." Pierce's eyes were no longer bothering to hide their coldness. "We'd like to come in and take a look around." "Do you have a warrant, Deputy?" Something flickered across his face, annoyance maybe, or the particular ugly surprise of a man unused to being questioned by someone he'd already decided was harmless. "Ma'am, this is an active safety situation. I don't need a warrant to check a home when a dangerous individual may be inside against your will." "Against my will," Margaret repeated slowly, letting the words sit in the cold morning air between them. "I'm sorry, Deputy, but I've lived alone on this ridge for 6 years since my husband passed, and I promise you I would know if there were a dangerous individual holding me hostage in my own home. Now, unless you're prepared to show me a piece of paper with a judge's signature on it, I'm going to have to ask you and your friends to step off my porch." For a long, taut moment, nobody moved. Margaret could hear her own pulse in her ears, could feel the tea kettle's whistle rising behind her like a scream building in her own chest, and could see in Pierce's eyes the exact calculation of a man deciding whether the risk of forcing his way past an old woman's front door in broad daylight outweighed whatever he stood to gain from finding what was hiding beneath it. Then from somewhere down the mountain, faint but growing a sound reached all of them at once, a low mechanical rumble that did not belong to any single engine, but to dozens, a rolling wall of noise building steadily louder with every passing second, echoing off the ridgeline like distant thunder that refused to fade. Pierce's head turned sharply toward the sound, so did every man behind him. "What?" Pierce said slowly, and for the first time since he'd arrived on her porch that morning, Margaret heard something in his voice that had not been there before: fear. The rumble grew and grew, rolling up the mountain road like an approaching storm, made entirely of engines, and Margaret Doyle stood in her own doorway, robe pulled tight against the cold, watching 5 armed men who had come to tear her home apart suddenly forget she existed at all, their eyes fixed instead on the tree line at the bottom of her long driveway, where the first flash of chrome and black leather was just beginning to break through the morning glare. Pierce's hand moved to his sidearm before he even seemed to realize he'd done it, his eyes still locked on the tree line where the sound kept building layer upon layer of engines, rolling up through the pines like the mountain itself had started to growl. "That's not backup," one of his men muttered, backing half a step toward the porch rail. "Pierce, that ain't ours." "Shut up," Pierce snapped, but there was no command left in his voice, only the thin edge of a man watching a plan come apart in real time. Margaret stood in her doorway with her heart hammering so hard she was certain the men in front of her could hear it, and beneath the fear buried deep and stubborn, something else was rising, something that felt dangerously close to hope. She did not know these bikers. She did not know if Wes's trust in them was earned or desperate, but she knew with absolute clarity that whatever was coming up that mountain road terrified five armed men far more than an unarmed 74-year-old woman ever had. "Deputy," she said, and was almost proud of how steady her voice came out. "Perhaps you and your associates should reconsider your business here this morning." Pierce's eyes snapped back to her, and for just a moment the mask cracked entirely, revealing something raw and furious underneath. "You called them," he said. "You actually called them." "I don't know what you're talking about," Margaret said. "I've been standing right here the whole time, deputy, same as you." The rumble was close now, close enough that Margaret could feel it in the porch boards beneath her slippers, a vibration that seemed to travel up through the ground itself. Pierce turned to his men, and whatever authority he'd walked up her steps with 20 minutes ago had evaporated into something closer to panic, held together by pride. "We're not finished here," he said to Margaret, low and vicious. "This isn't over." "No," Margaret agreed pleasantly. "I don't imagine it is." He backed off the porch fast, gesturing his men toward the cruisers, but instead of leaving, they simply repositioned, pulling the vehicles back from the mouth of the driveway into a defensive line near the tree brake, weapons no longer holstered, but held low and ready. Five men suddenly looking a great deal less like law enforcement conducting a wellness check and a great deal more like men bracing for a war they had not expected to fight in daylight. Margaret shut the front door, threw the bolt with hands that shook so badly it took her 2 tries, and ran for the kitchen. "Wes!" She dropped to her knees beside the trap door and hauled it open. "Wes, can you hear me? They didn't come in, but they're not leaving either, and there's something coming up the mountain that scared them worse than I did." His face appeared in the gap, pale and sweat-slicked, despite the cold cellar air, but something in his eyes had shifted since she'd lowered him down there minutes before. Relief, disbelief, and underneath both, a grief so old and sudden, it looked like it had been waiting years for permission to surface. "That's them," he said. "That's Duke. Margaret, help me up. I need to be up there. I need them to see I'm alive before anybody does something they can't take back." "Absolutely not. Your leg. Margaret, please." His hand found hers on the trapdoor frame, gripping it with a desperation that startled her. "You don't know what a scene like this can turn into if nobody de-escalates it fast. Duke sees Pierce's cruisers in your driveway and doesn't see me standing. He is going to assume the worst, and I promise you the worst assumption from that man leads somewhere none of us want it to go." Margaret hesitated only a second before hauling him up by main force, her back screaming in protest, his weight nearly dragging them both back down the stairs before she got him braced against the kitchen counter, sweat pouring down his face, his splinted leg held rigid and useless beneath him. "Window," he gasped. "I need to see." She half carried him to the front window, and together they watched through the gap in the curtain as the tree line at the bottom of the driveway finally broke open and the first motorcycles emerged into the pale morning, light chrome-catching sun that had only just begun to burn through the storm clouds. Engines roaring in a formation so disciplined, it looked almost military, 2 by 2, dozens of them, more than Margaret could count, in the first stunned seconds of watching them come. "Oh my God," she whispered. They came to a stop in a wide arc across the bottom of her property, boxing Pierce's cruisers and the black SUV into a space suddenly far too small for 5 armed men who had walked onto her porch like they owned the mountain 20 minutes earlier. Engines cut one after another until the sudden silence felt louder than the roar had been, and in that silence a single rider swung off the lead motorcycle, a broad gray-bearded man in a cut heavy with patches, and walked forward without hesitation, without a single glance at the weapons half raised in his direction. "Duke," Wes breathed. Margaret's grip tightened on his arm. "Wesley, if this goes wrong, if there's shooting—" "It won't." But his voice cracked on the word, and Margaret understood he was not nearly as certain as he wanted her to believe. Pierce stepped forward to meet the approaching man, and even through the glass, even from this distance, Margaret could read the sudden, brittle uncertainty in his posture, a man who had walked up her porch steps with total command and was now facing something his badge had never prepared him for. "This is private property," Pierce called out, his voice pitched too high too fast. "You need to turn around." "Funny," Duke said, loud enough to carry easily across the yard. "I could say the same thing to you, seeing as this ain't your jurisdiction to be running a raid on an old woman's home without so much as a warrant in your hand." He stopped a dozen feet from Pierce, close enough that Margaret could see him assessing every man in that driveway with the flat, patient attention of someone who had faced down far worse than 5 nervous deputies. "Where's Wes?" "I don't know who you're talking about." "Sure you do." Duke's voice did not rise, did not sharpen, and somehow that made it more terrifying than shouting would have. "Your boy Hale there was on the radio not 20 minutes ago telling half the county there was a fugitive holed up on Blackwater Ridge. We both know exactly who that fugitive is, deputy, and we both know exactly why he went down on that road 4 days ago instead of arriving where he was supposed to be." Pierce's jaw worked, his hand drifting closer to his weapon, and behind him his 4 men shifted uneasily, clearly recalculating the numbers now stacked against them easily. 30 riders visible in that yard, and more still sitting astride idling bikes at the tree line. "You're outnumbered," Pierce said, but it came out thinner than he probably intended. "And you're out of your depth," Duke replied. "Everybody standing in this driveway right now knows exactly what's on that drive Wes was carrying, and every single one of us also knows your name is on it, Pierce. Deputy Logan Pierce, badge number 4471, started running security detail for the transport routes 18 months ago. Right around the same time, 3 separate shipments cleared this county without a single vehicle getting flagged for inspection." He let that hang in the cold air for a long, deliberate moment. "You want to keep pretending you don't know what I'm talking about, or you want to talk about how this actually ends today?" Inside the house, Wes had gone rigid against Margaret's shoulder, his breath coming shallow and fast. "He's laying it all out," he whispered, right there in the open in front of Pierce's own men. "Duke's not bluffing Margaret. He's telling him he already knows everything right in front of witnesses who might not all be as dirty as Pierce is." Margaret watched through the glass as one of Pierce's men, the older one Hale, took a slow, deliberate step back from his own deputy, putting distance between himself and Pierce that had not been there 30 seconds earlier. His eyes darting between his boss and the wall of bikers, with the particular look of a man doing very fast, very frightened math about which side of this he actually wanted to be standing on when it was over. "He's losing them," Margaret breathed. "Pierce is losing his own men." Pierce saw it too. His head snapped toward Hale, some silent, furious command passing between them. But Hale did not move any closer to his deputy, did not reach for his weapon, simply stood there with his hand hovering uncertainly near his belt, torn between loyalty and self-preservation in a way that told its own story. "Get off this property," Pierce said louder now, more desperate, "or I will call this in as an armed standoff with a known criminal organization, and every one of you will be looking at federal charges by tonight." "Call it in," Duke said, "please. I would love for the state to come take a real close look at what's happening on this mountain today, deputy. I would love for them to pull the phone records on that burner you handed the nice lady in there, the one with no department letterhead on it. You want to escalate this into something official? Go right ahead. See how well that story holds up. Once real investigators start asking why a corrupt deputy chased an injured man onto private property with a search warrant he never actually obtained." Something in Pierce's face broke then, some final thread of bluff and control finally snapping. And for a terrible suspended second, Margaret was certain she was about to watch a man do something catastrophic, simply because he had run out of other options. Instead, from somewhere deep in the ranks of bikers, still sitting astride their machines at the tree line, a new voice called out, sharp and clear, cutting through the tension like a blade. "Duke, movement, west side tree line." Every head turned. Margaret's stomach dropped through the floor as she caught sight of it too, a flash of dark movement threading through the pines along the edge of her property, low and fast. Someone or something approaching from a direction none of them had been watching, drawn by the sound of dozens of engines, or perhaps already positioned there long before the bikes ever arrived. "Get down!" Wes hissed, dragging Margaret away from the window with a strength that seemed to come from nowhere. "Margaret, get down now. That's not one of ours, and it's not one of Pierce's, either, not the way they're moving." Outside chaos rippled through the standoff as bikers wheeled toward the new threat, several dismounting fast hands going to jacket pockets. Duke's own posture shifting instantly from negotiation to something harder and more alert, and Pierce, seizing the sudden fracture in everyone's attention, took the opportunity to back toward his cruiser, shouting something to his men that Margaret couldn't fully hear over the sudden surge of noise. "Who is it?" Margaret whispered, crouched now beside Wes on her own kitchen floor. Both of them below the window line, listening to the yard outside erupt into shouted commands and the metallic clatter of weapons being readied. Wesley, who else knows we're here? I don't know. His voice had dropped to something barely audible, raw with a fear that was different from the fear of Pierce, something closer to genuine dread. But if it's who I think it might be, Margaret, this just went from bad to something none of us are walking away from clean. A shot rang out. Margaret's whole body flinched violently, a scream lodging somewhere in her throat that she barely managed to swallow, and outside the shouting, redoubled boots pounding across frozen ground. More voices, calling out positions and warnings, the entire scene fracturing into a confusion of noise that made it impossible to tell who was winning, who was hurt, who was even still standing. "Stay down," Wes said, pulling her flat against the kitchen cabinets with an arm that shook from more than just cold. "Whatever happens out there, you stay down and you stay quiet. Do you understand me? What about you? I can't exactly run anywhere on this leg, can I?" A ghost of dark humor cracked through his terror, gone as quickly as it appeared. "But if that door comes open and it's not Duke standing there, I need you to promise me something. Wesley, promise me." His eyes found hers fierce and clear despite everything. "If it goes bad, you tell them I forced my way into your house. You tell them you never knew what was in that jacket. You never saw the drive, none of it. You did not sign up to die for this, Margaret, and I will not let that be how this ends, because I couldn't keep my own bike upright on a mountain road." Margaret felt something fierce and stubborn rise up through her, fear the same feeling that had once made her stand her ground in front of an entire school board when arguing to cut her classroom's funding, the same feeling that had dragged 200 pounds of dying stranger across her own front yard in a blizzard 3 nights ago. "I did not save your life to lie about it now," she said. "Whatever happens out there, Wesley, we face it together or we don't face it at all." More shouting outside, and then abruptly a different kind of silence, tense and watchful rather than chaotic. The sound of a confrontation that had reached some kind of pause rather than a resolution. Wes, Duke's voice carrying clear and urgent through the front door. "Wes, if you're in there and you can hear me, I need you to know we've got the situation handled out here. But I need eyes on you, brother. I need to know you're alive." Wes's whole face crumpled with relief so total, it looked almost like pain. He gripped the counter and hauled himself upright, despite Margaret's protest dragging his broken leg beneath him with a grimace that turned into a full grunt of agony as he put weight on it. "Wesley, you cannot be putting weight on that." "Margaret." He was already limping toward the door, sweat pouring down a face gone the color of old ash. "I have to let him see me. If he thinks for 1 second I'm not able to stand, if he thinks Pierce's people already got to me in here, I do not know what he does next, and neither do you." She caught him before he reached the door, wedging her shoulder under his arm to take the weight off the broken leg, and together they made it to the door in a slow, agonized shuffle that felt to Margaret like it took an eternity. She opened it to a yard transformed from 20 minutes before. Pierce's cruiser was still there, but Pierce himself stood apart from it now, hands visibly empty, flanked not by his own deputies anymore, but by 2 enormous bikers who had clearly relieved him of both his weapon and his authority in the span of the last several minutes. Off to the west side of the property near the tree line, 3 more bikers stood over a 4th figure, lying face down in the snow. A stranger Margaret had never seen before, dressed not in a deputy's uniform, but in plain dark tactical clothing that told his own grim story, hands zip-tied behind his back, unmoving, except for the visible rise and fall of his shoulders. "He's alive!" one of the bikers called toward Duke. "Winged him in the shoulder. He's not going anywhere, though." Duke turned from the scene toward the porch, and the moment his eyes found Wes, standing there, swaying, gray-faced, held upright only by an old woman, half his size. Something in the big man's hard-weathered face cracked open into an expression of pure, unguarded relief. "Jesus, Wes." He crossed the yard in a few long strides, taking the porch steps 2 at a time despite his bulk, and for a moment Margaret thought he might actually embrace the injured man, but he stopped just short, his eyes dropping to the splinted leg, the blood-crusted jacket, the exhaustion carved into every line of Wes's face. "You look like hell." "Feel worse," Wes rasped. "Who is he, Duke? The one your guys took down by the tree line?" Duke's expression darkened. "Don't know yet. No ID on him, no radio chatter matching Pierce's crew moved through those trees like professional muscle, not local law enforcement. My guess, and I want you to actually hear me say this, is That whoever hired Pierce and his people wasn't relying on the sheriff's department alone to handle a problem this size. They sent their own cleanup in case Pierce's angle failed. His eyes flicked to Margaret, sharp and assessing in a way that made her stand a little straighter, despite the fear still coursing through her. And you must be the woman who dragged a 200-pound biker out of a blizzard by herself. Margaret Doyle, she said, extending a hand that was to her own surprise no longer shaking. Duke took it, his enormous calloused hand engulfing hers entirely, and something in his weathered face softened as he looked at her, an odd searching quality to it that Margaret couldn't quite place. Margaret Doyle, he repeated slowly, and something shifted behind his eyes, some recognition dawning that had nothing to do with the events of the last 20 minutes. You said Doyle. That's right. Your husband, Duke said carefully. Was his name Frank? By any chance Frank Doyle taught shop class over at the high school before it closed down? Margaret's breath caught. How could you possibly know that? Duke's gaze moved past her into the house toward the photograph she knew was still sitting on the side table by her chair, the one of her son that she looked at every single night. Your boy, he said slowly, quietly, in a voice that had gone suddenly rough. Daniel, that was your son. The world seemed to tilt sideways beneath Margaret's feet. How do you know my son's name? Wes, standing beside her, had gone completely still, his face draining of what little color remained in it. Duke, he said low and urgent. Duke, is that you don't mean? I do, Duke said, and turned back to Margaret with an expression she had never in her life seen on the face of a stranger, a grief so old and so deep it looked like it had been carried for years, waiting for exactly this moment to finally set itself down. Mrs. Doyle, I think there's something about the man you saved last night that he hasn't told you yet, something that's been sitting in his jacket right alongside that flash drive this whole time. And I think once you hear it, you're going to understand that saving Wes's life on that mountain 3 nights ago wasn't the first time your family ever pulled him back from the edge of dying. Margaret's hand found the doorframe, gripping it hard, her heart pounding so loud she could barely hear her own voice when she finally found it. What are you talking about? What does my son have to do with any of this? Wes would not meet her eyes. His jaw worked silently, some battle playing out behind his exhausted face, grief and shame, and something that looked almost like fear of a different kind, entirely, and not fear of Pierce or the man bleeding in her yard, but fear of a truth he had been carrying far longer than 4 days. Wesley, Margaret said, and her voice cracked on his name in a way it had not cracked once through the entire terrifying morning. Tell me what he means. Behind them down in the yard, the man in tactical gear stirred against his restraints and let out a low groan, and Pierce, still flanked by 2 enormous bikers, chose that exact moment to find his voice again, shouting something about lawyers and federal charges that nobody standing on that porch bothered to acknowledge, because every ounce of attention had narrowed down to the single trembling breath Wes finally drew before he spoke. 7 years ago, he said, his voice barely above a whisper, I was face down in a ditch outside of Coleman County, so strung out I didn't have a name I could remember to give the paramedics, and there was a kid, 22 years old maybe, who pulled over on a road nobody else was stopping on and sat with me until the ambulance came, and then came back to the hospital every single day for 2 weeks after, because he said nobody deserved to die alone, even if they'd made every choice that led them into that ditch. His eyes, wet now, finally lifted to meet Margaret's. That kid's name was Daniel Doyle, and I have been carrying his memory in my chest like a debt I never got to pay back for 7 years, right up until the moment I crashed my bike on a ridge road and woke up to find his own mother dragging me in out of the snow. The yard around them seemed to go completely silent, even the wind holding its breath, and Margaret Doyle stood in her own doorway with her hand pressed hard against her chest, staring at the broken, bleeding stranger she had pulled from a blizzard 3 nights before, and felt the entire shape of the last 3 days rearrange itself around a truth she had never once seen coming. Say it again, Margaret whispered. Say his name again. Daniel, Wes repeated, and his voice broke fully this time, no longer holding back 7 years of grief he had apparently never let himself release in front of another living soul. Daniel Doyle, he wore a green jacket that day. I remember that. I don't know why I remember that of all things, but I remember him kneeling down in that ditch next to me, talking like I mattered, like I wasn't just some junkie who'd wrapped his bike around a guardrail and deserved whatever came next. Margaret's knees buckled, and it was Duke, not Wes, who caught her. his enormous arm coming around her shoulders with a gentleness that seemed almost impossible from a man his size. "Easy," he murmured. "Easy, ma'am. Let's get you sitting down before you go down on your own." She let him guide her to the porch step, her whole body trembling now, 3 days of terror and adrenaline finally cracking apart under the weight of something far heavier than fear. Daniel had never once mentioned this. Not in any phone call, not in any visit home, not in the last conversation they had ever had before the accident that took him 2 towns over, an accident that had nothing to do with any of this, that had simply been rain and a curve taken too fast on a Tuesday night. And yet here was a piece of her son's life she had never known existed, kneeling broken and bleeding in her own front yard. "He never told me," she said. And it came out smaller than she intended, the voice of a woman discovering a room in her own house she never knew was there. "31 years I raised that boy, and he never once mentioned pulling a stranger out of a ditch. Because he wouldn't have thought it was worth mentioning," Wes said, lowering himself with visible pain onto the step beside her Duke, steadying him from the other side. "That's exactly the kind of thing that made him who he was, Margaret. He didn't do it to be a hero. He did it because it was Tuesday and somebody needed help, and he happened to be the one driving past. He told me that himself sitting in that hospital room. Said his mother taught him a person's worth isn't in what they look like. It's in what they do when nobody's watching." His eyes, wet and raw, held hers. "I didn't know until last night when you said almost those exact words to me in the snow that you were the mother he was quoting." Margaret pressed a hand over her mouth. And for a moment, the entire chaos of the morning, Pierce still standing, furious and restrained down in the yard, the wounded strangers zip-tied near the tree line, dozens of bikers standing watchful guard across her property. All of it fell away into a kind of ringing silence, where only this mattered, only the impossible aching gift of learning her dead son had left one more piece of himself in the world that she never knew about until this exact moment. "He used to say things like that to me," she said finally through tears she made no attempt to hide. "I always thought he got tired of hearing it. I said it so many times, teaching kids for 31 years. I said it so many times I worried it had stopped meaning anything to him at all." "It meant everything," Wes said. "It kept me alive long enough to get clean, long enough to find the club, find a family that gave a damn whether I lived or died, long enough to end up on a road 4 days ago carrying evidence that could finally take down the people responsible for putting kids just like I used to be into ditches all over this county." He reached out hesitant and touched her hand where it rested on the step between them. "I have thought about your son almost every single day for 7 years, Margaret. I never knew his mother was still out here, still alive, still exactly the kind of woman who'd drag a stranger out of a blizzard because it was the right thing to do. If I'd known, I promise you I would have found you years ago just to say thank you." Down in the yard, the moment shattered as Pierce, apparently deciding that grief and reunion were a window of opportunity rather than a scene to respect, made a sudden lunging break for the tree line, shoving past the biker on his left, with surprising speed for a man who'd spent the last hour posturing about federal charges. "Pierce is running," someone shouted, and the whole yard erupted back into motion. 3 bikers peeling off in pursuit boots, pounding frozen ground, and Margaret watched with her heart in her throat as Pierce made it nearly 20 yards, before one of the pursuing men, younger, faster, tackled him hard into a snowbank with a crunch that carried clear across the property. "Get off me!" Pierce's voice, muffled and furious, rose from the snow as the biker hauled him back up by his collar. "You have no authority to detain me. This is assault. I will have every one of you arrested." "Funny thing about that," Duke called out, rising from the step, with a grim satisfaction that made Margaret understand exactly how much restraint he had been exercising until now. "See, we already made a phone call while you were busy trying to bully an old woman on her own front porch. Pierce, state investigator's office. The real one, not whatever fiction you were running with that fake badge number. They're already about 40 minutes out, and I'd bet good money they're going to be very interested in exactly what a county deputy was doing raiding private property without a warrant, alongside an unidentified armed man who came through the tree line and opened fire." The second things didn't go his way. Pierce's face dragged upright out of the snow, went in the color of old paper. 40 minutes out," he repeated, and something in his voice finally cracked entirely, the last of his bravado draining away into something that looked, for the first time all morning, genuinely and completely afraid. "Give or take," Duke said. "Plenty of time for you to think real hard about whether you want to keep playing this the hard way or whether you'd rather start talking about who exactly hired you to run interference on those transport routes. Because I promise you, Deputy, the people who actually run this operation are not going to be nearly as gentle with you as we have been once they realize you let evidence walk right out of your hands and into a state investigator's file. Margaret watched Pierce's shoulders sag. Watched something break loose behind his eyes. Some final calculation of self-preservation finally overriding whatever loyalty or fear had kept him running his mouth for the last hour. I want a deal, Pierce said quietly, before anybody else gets here. I want it on record that I cooperated. That's not up to me, Duke said. That's between you and the actual law once it shows up. But I'll tell you this much for free, Pierce. Every minute you keep standing there posturing instead of talking is a minute less goodwill you're going to have when they do. It was Wes, still seated on the step with his broken leg stretched awkwardly in front of him, who spoke next, his voice carrying an authority that seemed to surprise even him. Tell them about Sheriff Calloway, he said. The yard went very still. Margaret felt something cold slide down her spine. The sheriff, she said slowly. Our sheriff, the one who came to my kitchen and warned me about bikers passing through the county. The same one who happened to warn you specifically 2 days before I ended up crashing on the exact stretch of road that runs past your property. Wes said, not looking away from Pierce. That's not a coincidence, Margaret. That's a man making sure the only witness on this ridge was already primed to be afraid of the person she was about to find dying in the snow. Isn't that right, Pierce? Pierce said nothing, but his silence was its own confession, his eyes sliding away from all of them toward the ground. Calloway runs it, Wes continued, and now he was speaking as much to Margaret as to anyone else, laying out a truth he had clearly pieced together over months of terrified, careful investigation. Not alone, McGowan. There's a whole network above him. We don't have every name yet. That's part of what's on the drive. But Calloway is the one who made sure local law enforcement stayed blind to what was moving through this county. He's the one who assigned Pierce to the transport routes. And when word came down that I was carrying evidence that could expose all of it, Calloway is the one who would have known exactly which roads to watch, exactly which houses were isolated enough that nobody would hear a struggle. Margaret's hand went instinctively to her chest, to the memory of Sheriff Calloway sitting in her kitchen with his hat in his hands, warning her using the exact kind of practiced concern that made a lonely widow feel cared for and afraid in equal measure. He sat in my kitchen, she said, her voice shaking now with something closer to fury than fear. He drank my coffee, and the whole time he knew. We don't know for certain yet, Wes said gently. But Margaret, I would bet everything I have left that the timing of his visit wasn't concern for your safety. It was reconnaissance. Down by the tree line, the man in tactical gear, still restrained and now conscious, let out a low, bitter laugh that drew every eye in the yard. You people have no idea, he said, his voice thick with pain, and something that sounded disturbingly like amusement. How far up this actually goes. Calloway's not even the ceiling. He's barely middle management. Shut your mouth, Pierce snapped, but the tactical man only laughed harder, blood-flecked and reckless, in the particular way of a man who has already decided he has nothing left to protect. No, let him hear it, the man said, twisting to look at Margaret with an expression that made her skin crawl despite the restraints holding him down. Sweetheart, you think dragging your little biker friend inside made you a hero? All you did was paint a target on your own porch. There are people connected to this operation who are not going to care one bit about state investigators or federal charges. They are going to care about making sure that drive never sees a courtroom, and they are going to care about making sure nobody who's touched it, including a nosy old woman with a shotgun, lives long enough to testify. The words landed in the yard like a physical blow, and Margaret felt every drop of blood drain from her face even as Duke crossed the distance to the restrained man in 3 furious strides, crouching down to eye level with an expression that made even Pierce take an involuntary step backward. You want to finish that thought, Duke said low and lethal, or you want to think real hard about which side of this you'd rather be standing on when the real investigators pull up that driveway in 40 minutes. The man's bravado flickered just slightly, the first genuine crack in his composure since he'd hit the ground. I'm not saying another word without a lawyer, he muttered. Fine by me, Duke said, standing back up. The state can pull whatever they want out of you themselves. But you already said enough, friend, and every person standing in this yard heard it. He turned back to Margaret, his expression softening the moment his eyes found hers. The fury banked back down into something more careful, more protective. Mrs. Doyle, I am not going to sugarcoat what that man just said. It's true. Whoever's running this thing above Calloway is not going to just walk away because we won round one this morning. This isn't over, not for Wes, and I'm sorry to say not for you either. Margaret sat very still on her own porch step, the cold seeping up through her robe, the weight of everything her son's name spoken by a stranger's grateful mouth, the sheriff's betrayal, the threat still hanging in the frozen air, pressing down on her chest until she thought she might simply come apart under it. And then because she was Margaret Doyle, because she had stood in front of 30 unruly children on the worst days of her career and never once let them see her break, she straightened her spine, wiped her face with the back of one trembling hand, and looked up at Duke with an expression that made the massive biker actually blink in surprise. Then we don't wait for round two to come find us, she said. We finish this today while that drive still means something, and while there are enough witnesses standing in my yard that nobody can quietly make it disappear. Wes stared at her, something between awe and alarm crossing his exhausted face. Margaret, what are you thinking? I'm thinking, Margaret said, rising slowly to her feet, that Sheriff Calloway sat in my kitchen 2 days ago and lied to my face, and I would very much like to return the visit before he has any warning that his little scheme has fallen apart on my front porch. She turned to Duke. Does that drive have a way to prove Calloway's involvement specifically or only the network underneath him? Enough to bury him, Duke said slowly, clearly recalculating his read of the woman standing in front of him. Financial transfers with his name directly on them. Recorded calls between him and at least 2 of the transport coordinators. Then I think, Margaret said, that it's time Sheriff Calloway had a visitor he wasn't expecting. Absolutely not. Wes's voice cracked with alarm, struggling to push himself upright despite his leg. Margaret, no. That man is dangerous, and you are not walking into his office alone. I never said alone. Margaret looked at Duke, then at the dozens of bikers still standing watch across her property, engines silent now, but presence undeniable 30 men who had ridden through the tail end of a blizzard because one of their own needed them. I have quite a lot of company this morning if they are willing to lend it. For a long moment, Duke studied her, something shifting behind his weathered eyes. Respect mixing with a particular protective instinct Margaret had already seen him extend toward Wes. Daniel's mother, he said finally almost to himself, shaking his head with something that looked remarkably like a smile fighting through the tension. All right, Mrs. Doyle, you want to walk into the sheriff's office with an armed escort of Hell's Angels before the state investigators even arrive. I am not going to be the one who tells you no. But we do this smart, not reckless. We wait for the investigators, we hand them everything we've got here first, and then we make sure Calloway hears about his own arrest from a badge that actually means something in front of enough witnesses that he can't buy his way out of it later. Margaret exhaled slowly, the fire in her chest banking down into something colder and more patient. More like the version of herself that had spent 3 decades outlasting every difficult parent, every uncooperative school board, every crisis that had ever tried to knock her off her feet. All right, she said, we wait. But Duke, when those investigators do arrive, I want to be the one standing beside Wes when he hands over that drive. Sheriff Calloway is going to know exactly whose kitchen he sat in and lied through, and exactly whose son's memory he tried to weaponize against the dying man in the snow. Down in the yard, Pierce had gone very quiet watching this old woman rearrange the entire balance of power on her own front porch with a kind of stunned, dawning horror. While beside him, the restrained tactical operative simply laughed again, low and humorless, muttering something under his breath that sounded uncomfortably like a warning. Nobody standing there was quite ready to hear. And far down the mountain road, faint but growing a new sound began to rise beneath the settling quiet of the yard, not the roar of motorcycles this time, but the thin, distant wail of sirens, still minutes away, cutting through the cold morning air, like the first note of a reckoning that had been 7 years in the making. The sirens grew louder, closer, until the first state vehicles crested the final bend of the driveway, and Margaret felt Wes's hand find hers on the porch step, gripping tight, the two of them bracing together for whatever came next. A tall woman in a plain gray suit stepped out of the lead car before it had even fully stopped, badge already visible on her belt, eyes sweeping the scene with the fast-practiced assessment of someone who had walked into far messier situations than this one. Duke moved to meet her halfway across the yard, and Margaret watched the exchange from the porch, unable to hear the words, but reading the shift in the investigator's posture as Duke spoke, the way her shoulders squared, the way her eyes cut sharply toward Pierce, still standing restrained near the tree line. "Agent Reyes," Duke said loud enough now for the whole yard to hear as he gestured back toward the porch. "This is Wesley Callahan. He's the one who was supposed to reach you 4 days ago." Reyes crossed the yard fast, crouching in front of Wes with a focus that ignored everything else happening around her. The bikers, the restrained men, the old woman standing protectively at his shoulder. "You're alive," she said, and something in her clipped professional voice cracked just slightly with relief. "We thought 4 days with no contact, Mr. Callahan. We thought you were dead." "Close," Wes said and nodded toward Margaret. "Would have been if she hadn't found me first." Reyes turned, taking Margaret in properly for the first time, and something in her expression shifted from professional urgency into something warmer, more human. "Ma'am, I'm going to need your full statement, but I want you to know right now what you did out here. Most people don't have that kind of courage." "Most people," Margaret said, "haven't had 31 years of practice not backing down from things that scare them." Wes reached into the torn lining of his jacket with trembling fingers, and finally, after 4 days of guarding it with his own freezing body, handed over the flash drive, small and unremarkable in his palm, the object that had nearly cost him his life and had already cost so many others theirs. "Everything's on there," he said. "Names, transfers, recorded calls. And Agent Reyes, there's one name on it you need to move on today before word travels any further up this mountain. Sheriff Calloway." Reyes' expression did not change, which told Margaret everything she needed to know about how seriously the woman was already taking this. "We suspected as much. We've had eyes on financial irregularities out of that department for months. We just didn't have anything that would hold up until now." She closed her hand around the drive like it was something precious. "This changes everything." Behind her, 2 more agents were already moving through the yard, taking Pierce into custody with a formality that made his earlier bluster feel small and foolish. Reading him rights, he had spent the morning pretending he was above needing to hear, while a 3rd agent knelt beside the wounded tactical operative calling for medical assistance, even as she began recording his statement. It was nearly 2 hours later, after Margaret had given her account 3 separate times to 3 separate agents, after Wes had finally been loaded onto a stretcher for the ride to the hospital, his broken leg had needed since the moment his bike went down, that Sheriff Calloway's cruiser came up the driveway, lights flashing, unaware that the trap had already closed around him. He stepped out, smiling, that same practiced concern on his face that Margaret remembered from her kitchen table, calling out something about hearing there had been trouble on the ridge, and the smile did not fully leave his face until Agent Reyes stepped into his path with the flash drive already logged into evidence and 4 federal agents fanning out behind her. "Sheriff Calloway," Reyes said, "we need to talk about your financial relationship with a transport operation running through this county and about a conversation you had in this woman's kitchen 2 days before a courier went down on the road outside her property." Margaret watched from the porch as the color drained from Calloway's face, as his eyes found hers across the yard, and as understanding then something close to fear crossed his features before the agents closed in around him. She felt no satisfaction in it, only a quiet, settled sense of a debt finally being collected, a betrayal finally being named for what it was. He did not resist. He simply stood there, hands raised while Reyes read him the same words she'd read Pierce not 2 hours before, and somewhere in that moment Margaret understood that whatever storm had rolled through her life over these last 3 days was finally truly beginning to break. The days that followed moved strangely for Margaret, part exhaustion, part disbelief, part a grief she hadn't expected, grief for the version of Sheriff Calloway she'd trusted for 6 years, grief renewed for her son, now that his name had become tangled up in something so much larger than she'd ever imagined. She visited Wes in the hospital every day that week, watching his legs slowly mend under a cast, watching the haunted look behind his eyes soften a little more with each visit as the investigation expanded and the network above Calloway began piece by piece to collapse under federal pressure. Duke visited too, though he never stayed long, always finding some reason to check on the farmhouse on the barn roof that had been leaking since before her husband died on the fence line that hadn't been properly repaired in a decade. Margaret noticed it before she said anything, the way he'd walk the property with an assessing eye, the way small things kept getting fixed without her ever asking. "You don't have to keep doing that," she told him one afternoon, finding him replacing a rotted porch board without being asked. I've managed this place alone for 6 years, Duke. I'm not helpless. Never said you were, Duke replied, not looking up from his work. But Daniel Doyle pulled Wes out of a ditch and never once asked for anything back. Wes has been trying to figure out how to repay a debt like that for 7 years and never had the chance. Now he does. Now we all do. He finally looked up at her, something gruff and sincere in his weathered face. Let us do this, Margaret. Not because you need it, because we do. She hadn't argued after that. By the time spring finally broke over Blackwater Ridge, the case against Callaway Pierce and 11 others connected to the trafficking network had moved through federal court with a speed that surprised even Agent Reyes. The evidence on that drive so thorough, so meticulously gathered by men who'd risked everything to collect it, that most of the defendants pleaded out rather than face a jury. Callaway would serve 12 years. Pierce, having cooperated fully once the reality of his situation set in, would serve 4, though Margaret suspected he would spend every one of those years looking over his shoulder for the people further up the chain who had never been fully identified. Wes came back to the farmhouse the week his cast finally came off walking, with only the faintest hint of a limp, and found Margaret in her garden hands in the dirt, planting the first seeds of the season. Figured I'd find you out here, he said, easing himself down onto the porch step to watch her work. Where else would I be? She didn't look up from the soil. Somebody's got to get these tomatoes in before the season gets away from us. Margaret. Something in his voice made her finally set down her trowel and look at him properly. The club and we've been talking. About the barn. What about the barn? Duke wants to turn it into something. A recovery space for guys coming off the same road I was on when your son found me. A place where people can get clean, get steady without judgment, without a system that's more interested in punishing them than saving them. He hesitated, watching her face carefully. We want to name it after Daniel, if that's all right with you. Margaret felt her throat tighten, tears rising fast and unexpected, and she pressed a dirt-streaked hand against her mouth for a moment before she trusted herself to speak. He would have hated the attention, she said, finally laughing through the tears. He always hated being made a fuss over, but he would have loved the idea behind it. He would have loved knowing that ditch he stopped or turned into something that kept saving people years after he was gone. She reached out and gripped Wes's hand, the same hand that had once clutched her wrist in a blizzard, fighting for one more breath. Yes, Wesley. 1,000 times yes. That summer, the barn came alive with hammers and paint and the steady rumble of motorcycles coming up the driveway every weekend. Dozens of riders who had once been strangers to Margaret, now as familiar as family, each one bringing some skill or some story or simply some steady, quiet presence that filled a house which had felt too empty for 6 long years. They fixed the roof. They rebuilt the fence. They turned the old hayloft into a meeting space with worn couches and a coffee pot that never seemed to run empty, and on the door in letters carved by a biker named Cole, who used to work in a wood shop before addiction, took his career a simple sign that read, "The Daniel Doyle Recovery Garage, second chances start here." Margaret hosted every meeting herself, standing at the door most Tuesday nights to welcome whoever showed up, sometimes strangers, sometimes men. Wes had known, from years on the road, all of them carrying some version of the same weight he had once carried, and all of them finding in that converted barn exactly what Wes had found 7 years before in a ditch outside Coleman County, someone who refused to let them believe they weren't worth saving. On a warm evening in late summer, nearly 6 months after the storm that had changed everything, Wes pulled his motorcycle, rebuilt now new and gleaming, up to the farmhouse porch and found Margaret waiting on the steps, a scarf already tied around her silver hair. "You sure about this?" he asked, grinning, as he held out a spare helmet. "Wesley Callahan," Margaret said, taking the helmet from his hands with a steadiness that would have shocked the sheriff who once warned her about dangerous men passing through the county. "I dragged you out of a blizzard with my bare hands. I think I can handle riding on the back of your motorcycle." She climbed on behind him, wrapping her arms around his waist, the way she used to hold on tight during the rare motorcycle rides her husband had taken her on decades before. And as they pulled away from the farmhouse down the long driveway, where dozens of engines had once roared up to save both their lives, Margaret Doyle felt something settle inside her chest that had been missing since the day she buried her son. A sense that his life, his kindness, his quiet, unrecorded act of mercy in a ditch 7 years ago had never actually ended at all. It had simply been waiting patient and unseen for a frozen night on Blackwater Ridge to bring it roaring back to life. The mountain air rushed past them as they climbed the ridge road together. The same road where Wes had nearly died, now bathed in golden evening light instead of blinding snow. And somewhere behind them, back at the farmhouse that had once been so silent and was now filled every week with the sound of engines and laughter, and second chances being built. One repaired fence board at a time, a single lamp burned warm in the window, waiting for their return. Margaret Doyle had spent 74 years believing that courage was something quiet, something you carried alone in the dark and never spoke of afterward. She understood now that she had been wrong. Courage, real courage, was the kind that multiplied the moment you shared it, the kind that turned one old woman's choice to open her door into an entire community, rebuilt from grief, corruption exposed, and a family made not of blood but of loyalty earned in the worst night any of them had ever survived. And as the engine roared beneath her and the mountain wind pulled tears of pure, undiluted joy from her eyes, Margaret understood finally and completely that some doors once opened with love never truly close again.